Good afternoon. Welcome everybody, both in St. Andrews and around the world. We are very pleased to have you with us for the second of Professor O'Donovan's 6 Gifford lectures here at St. Andrews this year. We began on Tuesday with the first of the first set of lectures. The lecture series as a whole is divided into 2 parts, each consisting of 3 lectures. The first 3, a critique of the ways in which ethics has been in danger of disappearing from the university and from public discourse as a distinctive contribution to the way in which we know and move around the world. And Professor O'Donovan has begun to argue that the disappearance of ethics is related to the disappearance of its distinctive horizons or goods or intentions. So in the first lecture, he talked to us about the disappearance of the good. And in this lecture, he will move on to the disappearance of time before discussing the disappearance of the person in the next lecture, and then moving to the second set of 3, in which he will give constructive theological contributions to the reassembly or the building up of ethics again. We'll hear from Professor O'Donovan in just a minute. Before we do, some housekeeping points. The first is that there will be a time for Q&A after the lecture. The Q&A will be handled by submission of questions. You will see in the bar a question mark in a speech bubble that will allow you to post your questions, and we will then moderate and pose them to the speaker. There will not be time to answer all questions, and both the publication and the response to questions are at the discretion of the host and of the speaker, so we may not take them in the order of submission, and as I say, we will almost certainly not be able to get to all of them. However, Professor O'Donovan will be able to see the transcript of the entire questionnaire, of the entire Q&A after the lecture, and he will be very pleased to have feedback from you. So please do raise your questions, even if we don't get to them. The other thing to say about questions is that they are posted anonymously by default, but we would be very pleased if you identified yourself, especially if Professor O'Donovan is familiar with you. So please do put your name if you would like it to be known, and pose your questions as soon as the Q&A is live, which will be at the end of the lecture. The other housekeeping point is that, as our coordinator Robin Burray put it so nicely, this is the time of year when countries express their individual personality by setting different times for the change of clocks. British clocks are going back on the 31st of October, but the US and the rest of North America is not going back until a week later, and there may be other changes in other areas. So please do make sure that you have the right time when we continue next week. Without further ado, Professor O'Donovan, we're so pleased to have you with us. It was a very enriching lecture on Tuesday, and we look forward very much to this continuation. Over to you.
A meeting heavy with symbolism occurred on October 1827 in Weimar. The eminent Hegel dropped in for tea with the elderly and yet more eminent Goethe, and their conversation turned to dialectic. The philosopher explained that this word meant the regulated, methodically cultivated spirit of contradiction, which is innate in all men and which shows itself great as a talent in the distinction between the true and the false. This produced an explosion from the old man. Let us only hope that these intellectual arts and dexterities are not frequently misused to make the false true and the true false. Hegel parried that such a use of dialectic would be mentally diseased, only eliciting the acid retort. I therefore congratulate myself on the study of nature, which preserves me from such a disease. There we have to deal with the infinitely and eternally true. Now, what offended Goethe was not the commonplace idea that knowledge is reached by a zigzag course. It was the idea that knowledge was, in the end, no more than the contradictions involved in reaching it. Knowledge, he thought, must be decisively achievable. One who knows something about nature is at the far end of an inquiry, beyond the ebb and flow of argument, occupying the observer's viewpoint. Dialectic, on the other hand, admits no observers, only participants, and it defers an absolute truth until the end of history. By dialectic, in effect, Hegel referred to history as productive of truth. That meeting of the 18th century philosophy of nature with the 19th century philosophy of history was pregnant with a very great deal of 20th century reflection, from, one might say, Lenin to Einstein. Now, in our first lecture, we attempted to recover the link asserted in ancient philosophy between good and being. Something is good by virtue of what it is, not by virtue of what it is not. And this brought us face to face with two related challenges. One was to conceive the harmony of two different ways in which we know good, by enjoyment and by action. The other was to bring into view the temporal dimension that governs enacted good. So today we approach the frontier of time, another of the elements of moral thought that tend to disappear. Now, it can seem that good and time are detachable. The goodness of God is self-sufficient and eternal. Thou hast no need of my good, the psalmist declared, mine as belonging to this moment, this agent. The good is complete, and to worship and enjoy it is to be lifted up beyond the changing times of life and action. Yet pure enjoyment without action is not something we can easily conceive of. Knowledge of the good commands our existence, but existence is oriented to engagement in the world. Worship of the good may indeed have a timeless quality of contemplation, but it may also be a first action, a point at which the good that has no need of our good elicits a particular good response from us. And that is the logic that leads from the real good to the temporal good. Something is good for us, not only by virtue of what it is, but by virtue of when we meet it, by its coming first, or next, or later. We speak of the right moment for an action, or even for an experience. The same thing done or experienced earlier or later would not be as good. This first or next or later cannot be separated from our experience of the real good. Reality includes time as well as being. Now, of course, time may be seen simply as a lens through which unchanging regularities of nature are observed. Watch a rose bush for a year, and you will learn about its annual cycle of leafing, budding, flowering, and dying back. Watch many rose bushes for many years, and you will learn of their other natural features, their lifespan, varieties of habit, conditions for success, and so on. And all this will be essentially the same whenever and wherever it is learned. What I observe in my roses is more or less what my grandfather observed in his. Time displays regularities, natural regularities, including recurrent natural finalities or ends. As a form of life, the rose is always developing in a certain direction, towards a certain end, in search of nutrition, in search of growth, reproduction, following a natural course from immaturity to maturity. But then, of course, it is also leading on to senescence and death. Time's display of nature's regularity brings us back in the end to where we began. Goethe wrote, "Lass den Anfang mit dem Ende sich in eins zusammenziehen. Let the beginning and the end draw together as one." We may recall a line from T.S. Eliot which says something very similar. One way of putting this is to say that a rose has a life, but it does not have a history. Time reveals the rose does not reveal time. Theologians sometimes refer to what they call a circular idea of time. But in fact, it's not time that is circular, it is nature. Time simply displays nature's circularity. We would do better to speak, I think, of a refractive idea of time. Time as a prism through which the spectrum of nature is laid out in due sequence. Now, nothing in all of this could have caused Goethe any uneasiness. As a novelist and a dramatist, he was well used to displaying nature through time. But suppose we turn from the rosebush to another plant. We're advised by Jesus of Nazareth to learn the parable of the fig tree. From that, he suggests, we may learn about times that are coming. For when the fig leaves, we shall know, well, in the Eastern Mediterranean at any rate, that high summer is at hand. Here, the demonstrative relation of nature and time has been reversed. A natural form of being, the fig, responding naturally to its context, has become the lens through which we can mark the progress of time on a much wider front, towards a much wider finality. And that finality we refer to not as maturity, but as fulfillment. Those two ideas are very different. Maturity is observable. Fulfillment is not. A fulfillment is the end of an end, a higher structure of finality superimposed on a lower one. For ends form pyramids. Human beings have organic finalities of health and strength, which mature usually somewhere between our 20th and 30th year. But there are other regular finalities that are equally human beyond that threshold. Our effective activity, for example, depending as it does on acquired experience and not merely on physical strength, is at its height perhaps around 50. But then beyond that again, there is a finality in existence itself. And the attainment of that cannot be predicted and measured like the two lower finalities. Fulfillment is never recurrent. It's always measured, it's always aspired to. We know that we may succeed or fail in it, but we're never sure whether we have succeeded or failed. Call no man happy, said Solon of Athens, until he's dead. Yet, even then, we must reflect. It's only a crude conjecture, for we do not know that person's aspirations from the inside. So, if we go then and look beyond the individual life and ask about the life of a human culture, or even the life of world history as a whole, it's clear that fulfillment is something we can only view from a position of relative unfulfillment. It's a frontier we may approach, but not a territory we can have possessed. The idea of fulfillment is formed by our immersion in time, our inability to narrate more than a fragment of our past, while we look forward to a future that is at once a closed book and the focus of all our practical striving. Jesus' parable claims that, like the fig leaf that signals the approach of summer, so certain indicative events may signal the fulfillment of history. But that fulfillment is something we have to learn how to see and how to talk about. It's not like talking about regularities of nature. In the historicist thinkers of the 19th century, the term evolution was a term used not only for observable or conjectured recurrent processes of modification in specific organisms, but also for an overarching narrative of biohistory that would account for everything. Narrative is a sequential accounting of events with a logic of its own. It's quite distinct from classification and description. History is known through narrative. And yet the thought of a narrative of all history is very mysterious, because our immersion in time forbids us narrative access to the future of fulfillment. A comprehensive world historical narrative from the beginning to the end, such as was attempted and outlined by Augustine with some self-awareness of what he was doing, and not infrequently by medieval imitators with rather less self-awareness, is not what historians think of when they speak of their craft. What they do is recount segregated and partitioned episodes. They tell only one of many possible histories. They can inquire objectively into the history of commercial expansion in 18th century Britain, or they can inquire into the development of political structures in ancient Greece. But they cannot inquire objectively into history as a whole. For what history as a whole contains is what is still to become of us. History in the singular, as they use the term, refers simply to the art or method of objective inquiry that establishes a narrative of some particular history. So when philosophy conceives the idea of a single, all-embracing world history, a totality that is implied by all the partial histories joined up, we have to wonder how such a history could ever be told, and by whom it could be told, to us who are situated somewhere within it. To that question, faith believes that it may have an answer. It would seem that a revelation that accompanied the unfolding of history itself could give us an indication of its direction as a whole. Learn the lesson of the fig tree, it tells us. All that about history. What of history and ethics? Now, we plainly cannot entertain the idea that the good is simply an elaboration of the progress of time, a thought summed up satirically by C.S. Lewis in the phrase, goodness equals what comes next. The good cannot be reduced to indeterminate possibilities any more than it can be reduced to determinate facts. Yet it still seems impossible to disentangle moral thought from future time. A practical disposition consists of intentions directed to the future. Reflective thought may move both backwards and forwards at will through time, but existence always moves in one direction, out of the past into the future. And action has to follow that same direction. In proposing to act, we reflect on how things have been in order to deliberate on how things shall be. Action is not, as is sometimes foolishly suggested, wholly a matter of the here and now. The active present is inseparable from memories and anticipations. To try to live in a present without a past or a future would be an extreme form of dementia. Now, about this temporal direction of moral thought, let us make 3 observations. The first is this, that deliberation, which is the name we give thinking about what to do, is a stance in relation to time that is quite different from all other stances. It's different on the one hand from recollection of the past. It's different on the other from feeling in the present. Its object is future. The action that is presently a thought in the mind must shortly become an event in the world. And all our imagination is bent on how the world will be when that happens. Yet this is not anticipation in the common sense, which has to do with predicting events. When we deliberate on a course of action, we do, of course, predict, but we also assert a claim to decide. Secondly, it is an existential necessity that we deliberate not only on our deeds, but on our life as a whole. We care not only for what we are about to do, but for what we are going to become. We teach children this in the simplest way, don't we? By asking them, what do you want to be when you grow up? But what we are to become is necessarily much wider than what we are to do. It involves anticipations of longer-term future conditions over which we have no power to decide. To devote oneself to the practice of some art, let's say music, one must envisage a future, if only conjecturally, in which certain conditions that are important to that practice are realized. We must envisage being better at that art than we are today. We must envisage making sacrifices for the art in other areas of life. We must envisage being constantly at risk of the loss of skills or competencies by accidents, and so on. Action, life, and history. The 3 form a linkage in our understanding of the fulfillment of our agency. Andrew Errington, writing from Sydney, in a question which we didn't get round to on Tuesday, asked about that linkage and how it points to God. And that brings us to our 3rd observation. Our agency points us to God ultimately, not immediately, because we find that we cannot thoughtfully exercise it without some confidence in an ultimate future. So at least thought Kant, rather in tension with his primary account of moral thought as conformity to the form of law, which we glanced at briefly last time. Since law offers a critique of instinctive appetites, he argued, the conscientious application of law requires a higher object of appetites the expectation of a reconciled moral state, a state of blessedness. To pursue any good under the discipline of reason as we ought to pursue it, we need to pursue it in the context of a last good, an ultimate vindication of reason itself. And here we need a power greater than anticipation. We need a moral faith, a belief that ultimately the course of events will prove hospitable to the efforts of moral life and action. Well, what we draw from all this is that the use of moral reason involves not only aspirations for the future, but a number of different kinds of cognitive relation to it. Yet a cognitive relation to the future is not at all like a cognitive relation to the past. The past is determinate, it's known, it's recollected, it's narrated. It has happened. The future, though not out of reach of anticipation, of hope, of faith, is essentially unknown. Never can we think of the future as we do of the past, not that is without forgetting our historicity and pretending to occupy some imaginary lookout post with views in both directions. Freedom encounters the future as open and receptive, ready to be determined by action. Yet freedom also requires that we should be able to act fittingly in relation to the future. We're not doomed always to shoot our arrows into the dark. We may anticipate enough to aim responsibly. In anticipating things, we can use a prudence, a word which means, of course, foresight. And prudence is the capacity to interpret past experience and select from it that which promises some measure of persistent regularity in the future, allowing us a kind of partial probing of the future. Even prudent anticipation is no more than an approximation to knowledge, of course. The hard knowledge on which it depends is actually knowledge of the past, an experience of processes repeated with such regularity that we feel we may safely project them into the future, always hypothetically, but with some confidence all the same. Some processes are so broadly immune from interruption that we can agree, without stretching language too far, that we know something is going to happen. It would be too scrupulous to worry about a claim to know the hour of sunset tomorrow night or the time of high tide tomorrow morning. But most predictions allow us much less security than that. And some people are clearly better at making them than others. They're judicious in selecting the relevant predictive factors, in weighing their relative weight, in understanding the degrees of contingency to which they're exposed. And sometimes we may claim knowledge of the future on other grounds altogether, from revelation or second sight, in which case our conviction does not depend on our capacity to predict. But all forms of future knowledge of any degree of certainty or uncertainty are subject to this one condition. They are not knowledge of fact, as knowledge of the past is fact. Fact means done. And what will happen is, by definition, what has not been done. Which is why the conception of time that depicts us in the middle of a line that stretches equally out on either side indefinitely cannot begin to convey the reality of our temporal existence, which is an interface between what is closed and done and what is open and waiting to be done. All those teasing questions of science fiction about whether we could change the future if we only knew it can be given quite a short answer, I think. If we knew the future as fact, it would not be the future that we knew. There are no facts about the future. A system of ethics that rests everything on foresight of future outcomes, such as the popular utilitarianism that came to dominate the imagination of the English-speaking world for more than 2 centuries, can only present us with a distorted view of what prudence is. Prudence is concerned with the goods accessible to action in the short term, not with remote future goods resulting from long chains of causes and effects. Long-term outcomes are much less open to view than immediate ends of action, so that when we're solemnly told to judge what we do by what will produce the best results in the end, we're being told to anticipate what cannot be anticipated rather than what can be anticipated. What, anyway, could possibly count as the end? How long is the long run by which the short run must be measured? Prudence, acting within its range, is indispensable to good agency, but its range is no greater than what can be foreseen. So a doctrine that in theory urges us to consider the distant horizon and judge our actions by that tends in practice to cling to the short term and the predictable. And John Stuart Mill embraced this policy openly when he declared that actually living by a utilitarian ethic meant obeying the most generally agreed rules of action, which distilled the experiences of predicting outcomes of the most people. How then can ethics take note of the future? First of all, it has to recognize that all societies, all individuals, all planets, even all galaxies undergo crises which render the application of practical reason effectively impossible. What do we conclude from that apocalyptic horizon before which, as a matter of fact, we recognize we live? One conclusion is that if practical reason cannot contemplate such scenarios, it's wrong to think about them. Schleiermacher thought that ethics was a description of life in peaceful conditions. What happened outside peaceful conditions? Well, it was no concern of ethics. Entertain thoughts of crisis, at least in public, and you can be seen as irresponsible, as those who accurately foretold the economic collapse of 2008 discovered to their cost. Yet, since model reason cannot cut its connection with our interest in existence, and since our existential horizon is certainly not bounded by the predictable, we persist while fully accepting our ignorance of future conditions, in forming aspirations in relation to them. Sometimes we want to benefit generations to come. Sometimes we want to point the world to the kingdom of heaven. These are intelligible moral attitudes, and in fact, we usually admire them when we meet them, but they certainly do not conform to the limits of prudence. Existence reaches out to make commitments for a future that it cannot foresee. If it could not do so, there are various things we regularly do that we wouldn't. We would never marry, perhaps, and only rather rarely and cautiously would we sign contracts. Well, we can see why the original response to the expansion of utilitarian modes of thought was, and often has been since, an insistence on transcendent or absolute norms free of reference to particular pasts and particular futures. Fiat justitia dum ruat caelum, as the proverb says. Let right be done though the sky should fall. The ages of moralism, usually sickened by what they take to be the arbitrariness of public prudence and the pliable self-deceptions of private prudence, return to a belief in duties that are known apart from reasons for them. Inevitably, in such ages, the demands that people make on one another tend to be peremptory and authoritarian. Kant's doctrine of moral law inspired 19th century Europe to such a reaction, and we have now entered into another such age with our well-meant but crude doctrine of human rights. But such reactions can never be more than reactions. Duties may be self-evident occasionally, in moments of clear self-discovery and crisis, but their self-evidence is like a flash of light that makes everything around it dark. In the end, the only bulwark against arbitrariness is reasonableness, and practical reasoning cannot develop without some purchase on the future. To act under the guidance of an absolute principle unaffected by the paucity of our foresight, we must know at least this one thing about the future, that by so acting we shall, as Jesus of Nazareth expressed it, save our souls. But such a faith needs to find some ground in experience. What kind of ground could be available? I shall return in a moment to the forms that ground may possibly take. First, let me just pause a moment over the question as to whether these two rival strategies for moral thought, both of them formalist in Shaler's disparaging sense when he wrote about formalism in ethics to describe Kant, the one depending on future outcomes, which can of course never be known, the other on immediate duties, may not in fact be convergent strategies. Textbooks of ethics, such as Professor Holmes referred to in his introduction on Tuesday, and such as still, alas, seem to govern teaching in schools and colleges, and so ensure the corruption of youth, said that there were two rival theories of practical thought, deontological and teleological, each professing to give a total account of moral reason on its own formal basis. These theories were such stuff as dreams are made on, typical academic abstractions that no living human being could ever adopt or live by. One might even say that this two-theory was the original formalism in ethics, propounding the false claim that moral thought was not generated by real events and real situations that challenged our agency, but was self-generated. How then should we think of the opposition of prudence and principle, which sometimes can be real enough? We should think of it simply like this. Moral reason, which always mediates between the present emerging from the past and the prospects open to the present, may sometimes be led more prominently by sets of existing circumstances and relations, patterns of responsibilities, may sometimes be led more by future possibilities, opportunities, or dangers. So there are some moral questions that sound like How should a head teacher in a multiracial school respond when charges of racial bias are brought against a staff member of minority background? There are other questions that sound more like this. How may we find a sustainable way of achieving net zero emissions? Now, either type of question may accommodate a broader or a narrower range of factors in its answer. And either type may be pursued far-sightedly or short-sightedly. The key point, however, is that the form of each question is only a presenting moment in a substantial challenge to moral thought that is going to involve us, if we pursue it, in a range of questions of both types. Competence in moral thinking requires versatility. It requires that we pay attention not only to all the material factors that condition the situation, but also, in their turn, to all the prospects which the situation offers. So unwavering attention to the responsibilities and the roles, or a readiness to be led absolutely anywhere by an opportunity, are both deficient moral postures. Deficient because irrational, as any attempt to stop practical reason in its movement between the past horizon and the future horizon is bound to be irrational. The disappearance of the future good, like the disappearance of the real good, deprives ethics of an object. The future good may disappear into short-term anticipations based on very recent experience, which is to say into recurrent regularities that we have managed to observe, or it may disappear into the vacancy of a wholly unknown future, which we cannot even begin to think about or welcome. For most deliberation, we need to anticipate a definite future, yet we do not need to know that future in any detail at all. A certain experience of life, a certain sense of the space that lies open to us ahead is enough for most ordinary purposes. Yet these anticipations are fragile. They can be swept away in a moment when things go as we didn't expect. And our competence for agency can be swept away with them. To underpin agency, then, the disciplines of worship encourage us to recollect goods further in the past and to entertain the hope of a further future. Deliberation is very easily subverted by despair, for the horizon of the future is not always buoyant with hope, but sometimes heavy with threat. Jesus encourages us to grasp the future in two different ways: by seizing immediate opportunities while they are right before us, and by fixing our minds on the ultimate horizon. Yet at the same time, he tells us to take no thought for the future. That is, of course, the future that is neither immediate nor ultimate, that is too remote for prudent calculation, but still tempting to impractical speculation. There's nothing contradictory in those demands. They correspond, in fact, precisely to the logic of deliberation itself. The hope of an ultimate future is and can only be a promise, not a prediction. About such a promise, it may seem that natural theology, which talks of only what can be said in general, can say nothing. We may be tempted now to shrug our shoulders and conclude that any promise there is will be given by revelation, recognized by faith, unamenable to any general description. But what cannot be described cannot be thought of. If, in the light of past promises claimed and believed, there is at least an outline of the shape of a promise that could illumine our ordinary deliberations and actions. Faith and understanding may, here as elsewhere, prove mutually supportive. So let us think for a moment about one experience, as universally human an experience as could be wished, which has played a very large part in theologians' attempts to describe the response to revelation. And that experience is desire. Henri de Lubac captured the theological headlines by speaking of a natural desire for the supernatural. Neoplatonic metaphysics notwithstanding, we ought to dismiss any purported desire that has no reference to the future. I can't desire what is. The closest parallels to desire are anxiety and hope, and they too are future related. But while desire engages with the future, it does not know the future. It entertains possible future, knowing that they are merely possible, but trusting that they are no less than possible. Sometimes what we desire may also seem practicable, and in that case, the connection is simple between desire and deliberation. We begin to ask ourselves whether we should do something to satisfy a desire, and what we may do. But desires are often impractical, offering no way through to deliberation. We can desire, for example, the presence of someone who has died. Yet what is impractical is not unthinkable. We can certainly desire miracles, and we can know clearly enough what it would be like to receive the miracles we desire. And in that form, desire may still assist deliberation by pointing it in the direction of belief, of hope, of prayer, so that even where it cannot resolve on any other action, it still finds something significant to be done. Desire must always have some object that can be judged possible. If it has not, it ceases to be desire and becomes despair. Delight becomes death longing when all longing else is vain, Yeats wrote. So the point we came to in our last lecture is reinforced. The good that elicits our powers of agency is something real in the broadest sense. It belongs within the universe. It has a place. It offers us, at least ideationally, something realizable. Yet at the same time, the object of a desire is a good that is absent. Desire implies wanting, in the literal sense, that is, being without. There's always a temptation to lose sight of this and to expand the limits of desire too far. Desire does not include every kind of appreciation of the good. If it did, it would embrace the present good as well as the absent good. And the price paid for such an expansion of desire is to lose sight of its distinct character as an affection. Desire is different from liking, enjoying, willing, and so on. Desire is a specialized emotion. We can do deliberately what we feel no desire to do, and while desire may be a precipitating factor that carries us to deliberation and action, it's only one possible precipitating factor. There are others. A sense of duty, for example. And other strong emotions may replace desire and prompting action, as when we strike out in anger, weep in sorrow, shout in jubilation, sometimes in the teeth of a strong desire to control ourselves. So an absent good is not a good that has no being. It is a good that can be known as real, but unfulfilled, pregnant with unrealized possibilities. And that is how good excites desire in particular. It promises more of itself. The promise is central to desire. There's a great difference between desire satisfied and a pleasant surprise. In the one case, the good was present to the mind, anticipated, promised, looked for. In the other, it is an unexpected discovery. What allows these ideational presences is the capacity of real goods to generate promises of their own further realization. The object of desire is desirable because it is implied within a good already known. Desires are unintelligible unless they're born out of constellations of goods that we already appreciate. Elizabeth Anscombe once famously illustrated this by asking philosophers to consider their reaction to someone who claimed to desire a saucer of mud. To understand a desire, we must see the place it occupies in the world of goods. We desire to marry because we're in love. The more desire is focused on what is not there, the more arbitrary and pointless it appears, even neurotic. A composer might sensibly desire to complete Schubert's unfinished symphony, a work of which 2 perfect movements exist out of the classical symphonic 4. But it would make no sense at all to desire to complete Sibelius's 8th symphony, a work of which the composer talked a lot, but not a note survives, and perhaps none was ever written. Without a known good, the desire to supply what is lacking is empty and contentless. But one cannot desire to supply a lack unless the lack is actually felt. And if we feel that Schubert's new romantic aesthetic no longer requires a symphony to have 4 movements, then we will not feel that the unfinished is unfinished. So we will not desire to complete it. So the question put to us by desire is this: how do the goods we know and love come to lack things? And the answer brings us back to the refractive view of time. Goods reveal themselves in temporal sequences, appearing, disappearing, sometimes reappearing. And desire is the heightened awareness of the coming and going of goods, a distinct emotional response to temporality. It has its 2 characteristic notes of hope and of loss. Desired goods are not only promises waiting to be fulfilled, they are also reminders of things that were good and have passed away. Nothing in desire itself can tell us that the note of hope is more fundamental to it than the note of loss. Nothing in desire itself can assure us that loss is always going to be open to recovery. If the loss we experience when someone dies is to be made good, we shall certainly need to be told about that from some other source. Desire will not tell us. But suppose we are told about it, and told about it in a way that allows of belief, then we shall find that the promise of an integrated final satisfaction addresses desires that we quite ordinarily feel and gives them a cognitive significance that they could not otherwise have. Is there then a promise for history as a whole? If there is, it is the promise of a world-time conceived as convergent, purposive, and ultimately reconciled with itself. Whatever promises we may encounter in the regularities of life, the promise of history has to be given us through a historical event, a pointer to the end of history from within history. And since history never repeats itself, our belief that we may know something of history and its end will remain belief, not without grounds, but without a final verification. We shall know that a reading of history is true when its predictions have proved true, which is at no point within history. The clue to history, if we are to find one, must be given in a supremely meaning-bearing event or constellation of events which convey promise and elicit faith. This line of thought had its roots in the world of Alexandrian Judaism, which was open on the one hand to the teleology of Plato and Aristotle, and open on the other to the historical thinking of the Jewish scriptures. In the letter to the Hebrews, probably a production of Alexandrian Judaism, the promise of history is developed by a reading of Psalm 95, a poem about the wilderness wanderings of Israel that concludes, "Wherefore I swore in my wrath that they shall not enter my rest." The author invites us to read this last line in the light of another rest referred to in the scriptures, the rest of the Creator at the accomplishment of creation, symbolized and recalled in the observance of the Sabbath. Since, he argues, there was still another rest to be entered after the creation was complete, must we not think that the good of creation is waiting for an ultimate fulfillment, which we, as the pilgrims of history, are summoned to enter? From a slightly different intellectual tradition, one nursed in Hebrew prophecy and apocalyptic, another first-century writer known to us as John of Patmos follows an interestingly parallel train of thought. The universe, laid out in all its complex beauty and vitality before the Creator's throne, is seen to yield a perpetually recurrent and repetitive hymn of praise. But the prophet's view of this is interrupted by one troubling feature. In the hand of God, there is a scroll, sealed 7 times, and the sight of it reduces him to tears. Why? Because he confronts the very problem that we have been confronting: how the goodness of God in the repetitions and recurrences of reality can ever be known if there is no clue to the meaning of historical events. The question of the good of history, then, arises from an insufficiency of the good of nature. A good of nature could be good only for an ahistorical observer. Everything that does not recur and repeat is a threat to the sufficiency of the natural good. A positive account of history is needed, not only to fulfill the promise of creation, but to rescue it from reduction to meaninglessness. But this positive account is sealed against every attempt to penetrate it. The only possible solution is a proclamation. Weep not, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. Out of the history of Israel, John believes, the meaning of world history will emerge, but not in a straightforward line, not in a natural development. In a celebrated transformation of images, the prophet who has been told to look for a lion sees a slain lamb. It's to that lamb, in whom effective historical agency has been qualified by the experience of historical suffering, that the real disclosure of history and its good is entrusted. And that thought brings us to the third disappearing element in ethics, to which we turn in the next lecture, namely that of personal agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was magnificent, and we look forward to about half an hour of Q&A. Robin will now have switched the Q&A live, So please make use of the function in the chat, similar to the chat bar, the Q&A bar. Simply type your questions and I will be able to see them there and to bring them to Professor O'Donovan's attention. Oliver, while we wait for questions to come in, can I ask you to comment? You said that there is nothing in desire itself that can tell us that hope is more fundamental to it than loss, and that if, for example, the loss of a death is to be made good, we need to be told about this from some other source. Desire itself does not tell us. I can see, of course, that the promise or the potential actuality of a death made good, of a resurrection, is something that we cannot know except from a promise or some kind of evidence that comes from without, such as, for example, from the resurrection of Christ, which we probably have in mind. Do you have any sense that the fact of the desire of a continuance of life beyond the death that we see again and again as a regularity in history has any kind of cognitive value or significance? Where does the desire come from if our entire experience throughout the history of mankind has led us to see that death is the end?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, I think that's a very well taken point and well focused question. It seems to me the situation in which faith is placed when confronting history with its contradictions and its meaning and its meaninglessness is to decide whether meaning or meaninglessness has the upper hand in the end. And it's that decision, I think, that one cannot make simply by desiring it. Desire can mislead us. Desire can persuade us to think we know what we don't know. It's a common psychological occurrence. We know our desire is treacherous like this. But I think we can, if we have grounds for faith, I think we can find supportive resonances in a natural theology of desire, which is in a thought that goes something like this, that if history and its life is in the end simply swallowed up in meaninglessness, then certainly our experience of desire is swallowed up with it. That is to say, what I feel either means something terribly important or it doesn't mean anything at all. I mean, I think that is always the point which we are thrust back to. It's not possible to, I think this is the argument I think I want to make. It's not possible to pick and choose about meaning and meaninglessness. They are very absorbing, totalitarian, embracing things. And once one says, well, of course, the future of the world has no meaning, it's an utterly open, contingent thing, one has dumped a great deal of one's human experience without realizing it. That, I think, is what you're suggesting, Judith, and I strongly support that.
Thank you. We have a question from Amy Erickson. Could you speak to how disordered desire fits into your ethical framework?
All feelings, and desire is a feeling, it's part of our affectual resources. Feelings are types of strength, they're capacities that generate the possibility of action within us in general terms. All feelings have to be subject to thought. Not that thought, sometimes this is misconceived, as though thought is some kind of an abstract, beautiful commander, and feelings are a kind of jumble and mess of vitalities, and there is a kind of imposition like that. The meaning of our feelings is immanent to them. They tell us something of themselves. but we can remain in ignorance of what they're telling us. Disordered desire, I think, is an experience of desire that doesn't understand itself. That something is lacking in our lives, we're deeply aware of something lacking in our lives, can be an intense feeling, a quite preoccupying feeling, without our having the first idea really what it is that's lacking or how to set about finding out. And that is, I think, the meaning one gives to disordered desires. It has nowhere to go. It has, the desire comes, the feeling can be on its own, it's not self-interpreting. We need to be able to interpret it, which we have to do by placing it alongside everything else we know about the world besides the fact of our desire. And of course, the problem about very strong feelings is that they hide from us all the other things we know about the world. They push them out. So we get to a state where the only thing we're aware of is how much we desire something. And the realities surrounding that situation don't, as it were, appear to us with the weight that in other states of mind they would obviously have. So recovering them is, as it were, the recovery of the truth of the desire that we have.
Thank you.
That was a very nice question. May I just say thank you for that.
That's a very nice answer as well. We have a question from Bernd Vanenbech. It goes as follows. Would it be a fair interpretation of your discussion of prudence, deliberation, and desire to say that we must act confidently, echoing the Reformation distinction between certitudo and securitas, as opposed to thinking of time in terms of something to control or be controlled by?
What I find when Professor Vanenbech asks me a question is very often that he is gently pointing me along a line that I ought to have gone and failed to go. And I suspect that this is another such moment. I can see the fruitfulness of that. Obviously, yes, prudence serves our, let me just think how to put this best. Prudence is not an end in itself. It serves our capacity to act, and our capacity to act is not complete unless we can act in confidence and faith. Exactly what we can say we know about what we're doing will vary from case to case. Sometimes we have to knowingly take risks, yet there is still something we can be confident about, even in the decision to take a risk. And that, I think, is the sort of insight that Luther and his best successors have been able to bring to this question of action, the nature of confidence in asking it. Faith is the root of action, and prudence is, as it were, giving us the resources for an act of faith. I think I would take it a little bit like that. I think Vanenbech himself could probably take it on much more effectively, but that's as far as I can go with it for the moment.
Thank you. And Bernd, if you would like to follow up, please do so in the Q&A bar. Before we take a new question, I have a follow-up from somebody to your last answer to Amy's question. You answered that question on disordered desire with reference to desires which are too strong. What do you make of desires which are too weak or too inconstant?
Desire is clearly eliciting some very nice questions. I mean, people going straight to the point here. Thank you for that. What I say to that is exactly the same as I say about desires that are too strong.
Excellent. Very good. I'm glad we've settled that. All right. Then we come to the next question from Alan Strange from Leuven, following up from Tuesday. So we have a future that is pointed to and a pointer within history. But what meaning does this give to present lordship of the one who is resurrected and was already resurrected within history? So we have a question about what meaning does this give to the present lordship of the one resurrected? Does what we have heard have a pneumatology?
I shall want to say more to this in a later lecture, particularly in lecture 6, the last lecture of the series, in which I want to explore the pneumatology of ethics a bit further. But so I think if I may ask Alan just to hold back in patience just for a moment, I shall say, yes, it obviously does. I mean, action is its effect is in being present and available to us in our action as we grasp and comprehend the meaning of this sign and the meaning of the history in which we act. How we grasp it requires more care, and I will talk about that in the 6th lecture.
Alan, we look forward to having you with us until then and for that. We have a question from Johnny Walker at Princeton. How does the necessity of an ultimate future for practical reason, as recognized by Kant, relate to the need for that future's contingent revelation in history? Does the former render the latter redundant?
I think not, it doesn't. What one can and may say to Kant, if we accept that the very crude description of him I've given is near enough to the truth to discuss, what we can and must say to him is, you know, that without a hope for the future, practical reason cannot be a possibility. In the end, it's going to fail. It's going to lose confidence in itself and see itself as having no reason. We may always respond to that prospect by saying, so what? Is that not what facing up to harsh reality means? It's a question in its form rather similar to the one that you, Professor Wolf, asked at the beginning. It seems to me it points out to us, and Kant would point out to us, that if we dump a hope for the future, we are dumping a very great deal of our basic human experience with it, and including our experiences ourselves as agents. There are people who are prepared to do that, and perhaps all of us, at times of peculiar despair, have been tempted precisely to do that. And I think it is for that reason that all Kant has, one must say that all Kant has done is indicate a shape that is waiting for something to fill it in reason.
Thank you. And Alan says he is very happy to hold on until the last You're reassured. We have a question from King Ho Lang here in St. Andrews. In your account, can we say that God has desire? If so, in what ways may divine desire resemble or differ from human desire? Relatedly, would you say that your account of desire here is one of natural theology?
There's plenty of talk about the desires of God in the scriptures. This is part of the language of Hebrew prophecy constantly, and psalmody. So I think the question has to be is what we make of this, whether this is an edifying picture describing something altogether rather different. Of course, from one angle it has to be. Whatever God's desires are like, they're not just like ours, obviously. I mean, how would they be? One would end up with a totally anthropomorphic picture if they were. But is there something about desire that is perfectly compatible with the divine being? I think we have to say yes, if we believe that God acts. desire and action go together. And if there is a meaningful sense to speak of divine action, and the conditions of that are, again, things I want to come back to. Again, in the last lecture, I see I'm putting everything off till the last lecture. Isn't that dangerous? But if we are going to speak of the possibility of divine action, then the possibility of divine desire makes sense around that. That is to say, God places himself in action in a position where he has intentions, wills that are in time yet to be fulfilled. This is the difference, one might say, by speaking of God in himself, in his aseity, in the features of his being which belong to him just as God, and in the economy, in history, in his creating a world of time in which to be present. And those two languages will sound rather different.
Thank you. King, if you would like to follow up, please do so in the Q&A. We have a question from Andrew Errington in Sydney. Even with a disclosure of an ultimate meaning of history in the lamb that was slain, history remains opaque in certain respects. Does ethics have an interest in broader and sometimes adventurous narratives about what is going on?
That's a pretty good question for somebody for whom I think it is 4:30 in the morning, and who defies time by asking it tomorrow morning. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, obviously ethics has an interest in such more adventurous narratives. But it also has an interest in understanding their cognitive status and distinguishing between what one might call speculation for speculation's sake about history and narratives that can open themselves to some degree of demonstration. No narrative of history as a whole is capable of utterly demonstrating itself. It's always going to be indicated by signs within history, which may then change. That goes for Christian narrative, it goes for Marxist narrative, very evidently for Marxist narrative, which on some accounts has now been decisively finished by events. I mean, whether or not that's true. But so long as a narrative is proposed that deserves cognitively some kind of thought and examination and concern, then I think ethics can't just dismiss it. It is part of coming to terms with the reality of the world that is part of realistic ethical thinking.
We have a question from Jonathan Chaplin, who's giving you the get out of jail free card right away by saying maybe this is in a future lecture. But here's the question. Is there a sense in which our eschatological orientation in faith towards the fulfillment of all desire illuminates our orientation between the times towards and our prudential deliberation about our desire for the fulfillment of natural ends, such as marriage, knowledge, art, production of material goods, and so forth?
Yes, there has to be. I mean, I think that answer is susceptible of that question is susceptible of a direct positive answer, in that the ultimate can only be ultimate in relation to provisionals. The ways in which we understand such things as a final good, a reconciliation for history, are all drawn from our appreciation and experience of smaller, temporary, passing goods, which we realize and see realized around us, and can seek and sometimes bring about, including artistic goods, cultural goods, and so on. And we have no model for fulfillment, except that which we understand from the world in its parts. If we imagine a divine message saying, this world is to be fulfilled, which then goes on to say, but this fulfillment is utterly different and of another kind altogether, without correspondence to any fulfillments that one experiences in the activities of this world, we would not know what to make of that promise, whether it was a promise or a threat, in fact, and of a creator God and a providential God, it is not an announcement that one would credit, because in this sense we go back to God and desire. God himself has his purposes for this world in which there are provisional ends, and indeed in history sets up the conditions for the realization of such ends and commands many of them.
We have a question from Robin here in St. Andrews, Robin Beret. I would like to ask about desire for imaginary objects. Must it be despair to want a unicorn? Can we not desire something through myth?
Yes, another very nice one. Thank you, Robin. We can desire, so that perhaps the giveaway in the question is the preposition through. And so long as the through is heard, then yes, certainly we can. I think there are things, let us imagine somebody sitting down and reading Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and ask what kind of experience of joy, delight, and perhaps desire such a reading excites. Does such a person desire the perpetual triumph of the kingdom of Gondor? Or does, this is a reader in our own world, of course. While reading the book, he or she may desire that the author will ensure by the end the triumph of Gondor. That's because imaginatively the reader is drawn into the book and, as it were, inhabits this world in which the triumph of Gondor is a desirable object. Standing back, no longer reading, it's impossible to desire the triumph of Gondor, but it's possible to recognize that desire for such a thing is a mediation of desire for what? For something further. Something which that cultural object, that imaginary object, speaks to us, and that imaginary objects are drawn into networks of significance in this way. That is perfectly intelligible, I think, and acceptable. I don't know whether that's enough to satisfy you, Robin, but it's, I think, what I can come up with in the first moments.
Thank you very much. We have a number of other questions in the Q&A for which we don't have time at the moment, so I will leave them to you, Oliver, afterwards. And if you want to make reference to any of them in any future lectures, please do. They are very interesting questions. We are at time, however, and I will put in the Q&A the link for the next lecture, which will take place next week on Tuesday. Thank you so much for a wonderful evening. You'll see that it's excited a lot of interest in the constructive proposals to come, but also in the question of personhood and what is involved in personhood. And so we look forward to the unfolding of that in the next lecture, and then the constructive proposals in the weeks to come. Thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us from all the different time zones. Please do come again next week and have a lovely weekend. Goodbye.